Welcome to Behind the Book. It's time now for Behind the Book, hosted by Tess Thompson and Karen McQuestion, two authors with a passion for books, no filters, and limitless curiosity. Join them now to find out the real story behind your favorite books and authors. And now, Behind the Book.
Welcome to another episode of Behind the Book. Today I have a special treat. I'm going to be interviewing my podcast partner, Karen McQuestion, and I'm excited to hear some of her answers to these questions. As we've gone through all these interviews, we've started thinking that we would like to know the answers from each other. So we're going to do Karen today, and we might do one with me later. Anyway, welcome, Karen. How are you?
I am fine. Thank you, Tess. This is fun.
Yeah, it's all about you.
I know. It's about time, right?
It's Karen Day. All right. So walk us through your publishing career. How did you become a novelist? What was your publishing journey like?
I started in third grade, but when I first wanted to be an author, I will fast forward to liven things up a bit. I had been attempting to get novels published for about 10 years. So once my kids were in school, I realized I didn't have any more excuses. So even between working part-time and having the family and taking care of that, I was writing novels. I joined a local writers group, and eventually I finished a novel, and then I finished a couple more. And in between this time period, I got an agent for one of the books, and he wound up leaving the business, but he did try to sell it. It was unsuccessful. And then later on, I got another agent with a bigger agency, and he sent it out and didn't sell it either. So it was very disheartening because I kept feeling like I was just on the cusp of having something happen, and then nothing would happen. So after about 10 years, I had many novels, and I thought I would die an old lady with, manuscripts under my bed or my hard drive full, either way. And for some reason, someone said, why did you keep doing it? I don't know if I was delusional or what it was, but I had this feeling that if I just continued on, at some point, something's got to give, that I would eventually see success. So as part of this ongoing endeavor to get published, I kept up with publishing blogs and articles, and I read writing books. And there was on one of the publishing journals, there was a little article that said a guy named Boyd Morrison had attempted to get published. And his story was much like mine. He had an agent. The agent sent his novel around. It didn't get published, and he put it up on Kindle, the unpublished manuscript, and sold 7,000 copies, and was eventually picked up by one of the publishers who had rejected him. I read that, and it was, a light bulb moment, as they say. I thought, I'm going to do that. I mean, I knew what a Kindle was. I didn't know that anyone could upload a book. I for some reason, I had thought it was limited to Random House, but, who thought Karen McQuestion in Heartland, Wisconsin could do it? So at that point, there were no directions on formatting. It was just upload your manuscript. And luckily, my husband is a computer engineer, which was helpful, but not as helpful as you would have thought, given that it was a different kind of thing. But we took a weekend and uploaded 2 of my manuscripts. And it took a lot of tries. We would upload it, and then I would look at it, and the formatting would be terrible. And then I'd make some changes, and I didn't know HTML at the time. So I'm frantically Googling, eventually got it up, and it looked halfway decent. We had to create our own book covers, which that was, another kind of learning curve. It was really stressful. I remember Greg saying, this better be worth it. This better be worth it. And I thought, well, here goes nothing kind of thing. So over the weekend, we did it beginning of the weekend. On Monday, I'd had 4 downloads of one of my books. And it happened to be a book called Easily Amused, which was a romantic comedy. And at the time, if you put romantic comedy in the search, Kindle books, only 4 of them came up, and one of them was mine. So I really benefited from the timing. At the time, there were 350,000 books on Kindle, which I remember thinking, oh, all those books, how am I going to, how am I going to stand out? But a lot of them were not well formatted, or they were much older books. There would be like 12 versions of Frankenstein or whatever. So it really wasn't as daunting as I had thought. And now there's millions and millions. So it was a good time to get in the door. So I uploaded every weekend, we'd upload more because I had all these books. And the one that I almost didn't upload, as Scattered Life, was the one that started to take off. And I saw on different message forums that people were recommending my books to other people. I mean, I just couldn't believe it. I just would like read it and go, it was almost like they were talking about a different Karen McQuestion. I was like, wow. Then I would jump in and thank them. So I got to know a lot of the readers. It was just really an incredible time. So then after that, I was just sort of basking in the glow of making actual money and having people read something I had written. And I also followed a blog, Joe Conrath. Do you remember him? In the early days, he had a blog that everybody who was self-publishing read. And he was giving his numbers and basically saying, you should be doing this. If you've got a good book and you can't get it conventionally published, you should be doing this. And people were like, yeah, but you're going to lose your credibility if and when you do want to publish, or who's going to, people don't buy it. None of these are selling. And he put a call out and said, I can't be the only one that's doing well. Whoever is reading this, if you're doing well, you need to leave a message, or you leave a comment after my post. So it was late in the evening and I posted, I have 6 books on Kindle, and I can't remember how long it was at the time, a couple months, and I've sold 30,000 copies. And then I went to bed and I woke up in the middle of the night and I thought, what have I done? Like, I'm from Wisconsin and you just don't brag. I thought either people will think I'm lying or they'll think that I am bragging. And I'm going to get like people that hate me. I was like, if it had been on my own blog, I would have deleted it, but it was on his and I couldn't take it off. And I really laid in bed like, oh, this is a big mistake. I should have just quietly accepted my success and just kept my head down. And so anyway, I woke up in the morning and I really went to see if anyone had commented after mine. And people were so lovely. They were so excited for me and they wanted to know, like, do you have any tips? Good for you. And which made me feel much better. And then after that, things just really took off. The Wall Street Journal contacted me. They had gotten my name from Joe and they were doing a spread on it. And so I was on the front page of one of the intersections. And then I got about 7,000 emails after that. And
Wow.
yeah, it was overwhelming. And most of them were from other writers, and they would say, your story is exactly like mine. I have been trying to get published. I've sent it to small presses. I've sent it to agents. I've queried editors, and I just have had zero luck. Then for a while, I was answering emails, mostly in the evening. And it didn't occur to me to create like an autoresponder. I would want to help people. And later, a lot of people said, you emailed me, and I have no recollection. It was just a haze. But I'm glad I was able to give people hope. And after that, I remember Amazon had started their own publishing house, Amazon Publishing, which a lot of people to this day get confused with their self-publishing division. This is actually a company that's run much like Simon & Schuster or Random House, which is not Random House anymore, is it? But anyway, they would acquire books and put their marketing power behind it. And at that point, they were acquiring self-published books that were doing well because they had all the data. And so the first one they were interested in was A Scattered Life. And they contacted me, and that began a really long and fruitful partnership. The really wonderful thing about working with them was their focus was on digital, which was easier in a lot of respects to sell than trying to get somebody to buy a physical copy of a book. I think we're all kind of click happy. So if you see something and you read the sample or someone recommends it, if it's affordable, people were more willing to give things a try. So I benefited from that as well. So that was
what
basically.
year was this?
I self-published in 2009, and Amazon republished my book starting 2010.
So really early in the self-publishing world.
Really early.
Yeah,
And
because I can remember my now ex-husband saying, well, what about self-publishing? And this was like maybe 2010. And he's like, I'm reading about all these people doing this. And I remember saying, no, I can't do that. I have to be a real writer, with no clue that would have been a really smart thing to do.
well, I know I was in a writers group with 3 other people who were all writing novels, and they were all very gifted writers. I would say their writing abilities in many ways exceeded my own. And I would say, you guys have to do this. And they had the same reaction. They were like, no, they felt like that was the difference between being in a church play versus being on the big screen. It was, to them, they wanted to do it the right way. And I understood that, but I just kind of got the feeling with New York publishing, they were never going to let me in. I was too something. My books were too Midwestern or too quiet or too sweet, or they like things with great marketing hooks. It makes it easier to sell. And I do understand that. But I also had the feeling that if I could reach readers, that there were people out there that might really enjoy my books.
Well, you were right.
Thankfully,
Yeah.
because my husband told me it better be worth it.
Yeah. Well, those first 4 copies, that was the beginning of 10 years of great success. So,
Oh, and Greg would say, let's go for double digits or let's go for triple digits. And I would like, you always keep raising the bar. You're making me stressed out.
so you mentioned you had a part-time job when the kids were little. What was that?
Well, I was the Christmas help at Kohl's, a department store that I love to shop at. And then my kids also got some really nice clothes there with my discount. And then I was also freelance writing. So I had an essay in Newsweek. They had a My Turn column where people sent personal essays. And I had articles in the Chicago Tribune and a lot of parenting magazines, things that aren't in existence anymore. And there was also a local newspaper chain called CNI Newspapers. And I did feature articles for them, maybe 1 or 2 a week for a really long time.
Wow.
It was CNI, but my mom kept getting it confused and telling people I wrote for CNN. So they were they were very impressed.
I thought you were going to say CSI, the television show.
Oh, that would have been cool too. Thanks, Mom.
Yeah. Oh, that's funny. So those first 6 books, are those still available?
All but one. I had a book that I filled with personal essays, and they were, for the most part, essays that I had gotten published in parenting magazines. And I called it Lies I Told My Children. And I realized it was up for a year or 2, and I realized they were getting older, and some of these stories were kind of embarrassing. In fact, they said they didn't care. But I just thought that at some point they would mind. So better to pull it sooner rather than later.
I love that title, though.
It was humorous. I don't actually really lie that much, but I remember my oldest son was really full of energy. He was just a kid who was like if you took him shopping, he was like all over the place because he had to look at everything and touch everything. And I remember I leaned over once and said to him, that man over there is not happy that you're not behaving. And it's just some random guy standing in the store. And he looked at him and he totally behaved. And my husband was like, you told him that? And I'm like, I had to.
You could have added, and he might someday be your employer.
And he'll remember this when you were 3 and you did not listen to your mother.
All right. So how many titles do you have published at the moment?
I always think it's funny that authors don't know. I think it's 21. I think I'm working on the 22nd one.
Yeah. And I'd heard your self-publishing story before because obviously we're friends, but I didn't realize you had 6 altogether to put up right away.
That helped a lot, actually.
Yeah.
And even now it does for people who are self-publishing, that having a backlist, because if they love your book, then they go to look for another one. If you don't have one there, you lose them. So that's always advantageous, I think.
Well, and it was nice too, because you're not the only person who kind of had that similar story of these books that had gotten rejected, and then you put them up there and people go crazy for them. It's just must have been very gratifying to finally sort of be recognized for this work that you had believed in but couldn't get other people to.
Oh, it was a definite neener moment. I mean, just
Yeah.
myself. And, I realized that people in publishing houses make decisions based on their marketing department, what they think will sell. So they didn't want to take the risk, even if they liked the story or the book. They didn't think fiscally it made sense. But to me, I didn't have the overhead. So it made perfect sense.
All right, so tell us about your process. Do you have a time of day that you write or a word count goal? How do you organize your day?
First of all, my process has changed over the years. And I think that's true of a lot of authors. I used to actually write longhand in a notebook, and I would do like so many pages. And then after that, I would type them up. And I don't know when I stopped doing that. I think it was when access to a computer became easier because we just had the one and my husband was using it for work. So I write on my laptop. That part's very consistent. And morning is best. And when I first start a book, I'm lucky to get 500 to 1,000 words done in a day because I'm just laying track. I might have a premise and some characters and an idea, but everything's not kind of cemented in yet. And I'm kind of feeling my way into the story. And then once I make some headway into the book, then my word count seems to accelerate, much like when you're reading a book and you really get into it. So I would say mornings are best. I don't write every day. I try to, but this morning I had a dentist appointment and that threw me off. And so it happens. So that's pretty much how I operate.
Yeah, it's funny about the dentist appointment thing. We should call it that, like the dentist appointment phenomenon or whatever. I find that if I go anywhere, I can't come home and write. It's like it's not part of the day anymore or something.
Mhm.
I don't really understand why, but that's true for me as well.
You interrupted the creative flow, I think. Something.
Yeah, something. Or maybe we're just looking for an excuse.
That could be it too.
All right. So if listeners are unfamiliar with your books, which one would you suggest they start with?
I actually think my earlier ones should be unpublished if it was up to me, but they're not. I didn't self-publish them. They're with Lake Union Publishing, and people are still reading them and leaving lovely reviews. So I tend to the more I write, usually I'm happier with my later books. I had a really fun book that I wrote for the middle grade audience, which is kind of a Charlotte's Web, 8, 9, 10 years old, and it's called Grimm House, which was one of my the books that I loved writing the most, and it just came out all in a rush. I mean, I always felt like I was just taking dictation. It was so much fun to write, and so if any of our listeners have kids who liked Coraline or A Series of Unfortunate Events, anything like that, they might like Grimm House. And my favorite book, I know you're not supposed to have favorites, but I really loved writing Dovetail. It's a novel that I thought about for several years, but I didn't write it. I kept thinking about it, and I almost felt like all the little puzzle pieces were coming together in my brain, and I had to wait till it was somehow morphed into a story before I could sit down and write it. And it has two timelines. In the early 1900s is one time frame, and 1983 is the later time frame. And some of the characters in the earlier time frame are elderly people, and it's two intersecting stories. I had a lot of fun writing it. It wasn't easy to write because I've never written anything historical before, and I was very nervous about that, getting the details right. I read a lot of love letters that soldiers wrote to their sweethearts back home in World War I, because it was the same era, to get an idea of how people talked. And then I spent about 2 days reading these love letters and just being wrecked, because then they'd say, this private so-and-so was killed in action on such and such a date. And I was just, these are real people is what it came to me. I'm doing research, reading what he wrote to the woman he loved, and they're 19 or 20, and they just barely got started. So Dovetail has a lot of, there's some mystery, there's a love story, it's got the historical element to it, and it's a book I'm proud of. So I would definitely say that most readers who like those kinds of things would enjoy that book.
Well, it's my favorite of yours. I love all your books, but that's just clicks every box for me of what the kind of books I like to read.
Oh,
So,
good. Thank
yeah.
you.
And I know it's done very well for you. So I see it in the Amazon store up there on the #1 slot. Another recent book was kind of a departure for you. I guess you would call it a domestic thriller, The Moonlight Child. Tell us about that.
The Moonlight Child is, I think it's more of a women's fiction with a domestic suspense sort of slant to it, because there's no twist and turn where you're trying to figure out the situation. The situation is presented up front. It's just how is it resolved. A couple years ago, I had read about a family who lived in a suburb not too far from my house, who had a woman living with them who had lived with them since she was a child. And she was not allowed to leave the house except with them. She was their housekeeper. She had been their babysitter. She basically was an indentured servant. And they sent money home to her family, but she didn't have any money. She didn't have any identification. She didn't know her rights. She was just stuck, and they weren't particularly nice to her. So the older son became engaged, and the fiance was like, why is this woman always in your house? Because she had heard conflicting things. I think they told her she was their cousin. So eventually the engagement did not work, and they broke it off, and she reported them to the police. And these were well-to-do people who lived in, they were upper middle class, they had professional jobs. And I remember thinking the neighbors had no idea. I mean, she had been there since she was a little girl, and now she was an adult woman. And so that was the jumping off point for this story. It stuck in my brain. Do you really know what's going on at the neighbor's house? Could they have somebody there that's not allowed to leave, who's basically being held captive by this situation? And so that was where the story originated from. In the beginning of my book, a neighbor notices a little girl very late at night. It looks like she's washing dishes, and she has to be standing on a stool because that's sort of how it looks. And when she confronts the family, they say they don't have any little girls, and there haven't been any little girls visiting them. And she just gets the feeling that something's wrong. She and another member of her family, a teenage girl who just had aged out of the foster care system, who has moved in with her, they decide to investigate on their own. So I had published it myself thinking, this might not go over well. It's different from my other books. I don't know if my readers are going to feel like, wow, you took a left turn, lady. I'm not on board with you on this one. But as it turned out, it's been my most successful book to date, which just astounds me. I think it's the combination of, it's got some of the domestic suspense elements, but it's really a gentle story in a way. You don't see the abuse. There's one scene, but it's not too bad. It's more you want to know what happens. And I also think, I know I'm this way, I always feel like if I had the opportunity to make a difference or be a hero in someone's life, you always think if you were the one at the bank that was being held up, that you would do the heroic thing. Probably I wouldn't, but I'd like to think I would. So I think a lot of people that read it, they feel for this little girl. And there's also a teenage son in the household, and he's sort of, in a way, he's helpful, but he's also in a bad situation himself. So I think they feel like this would be me. I would be the one that wouldn't take that for an answer, and I would keep pursuing this. That's my guess as to why it's popular. Otherwise, I have not a clue. I'm just happy.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, I read it obviously, and I really enjoyed it. And I think you're right. I hadn't thought about it before, that it isn't a thriller, it's a suspense, because as you said, you already know the situation, and then it's just sort of, how did it unfold? How will it be resolved and everything? One thing I'm curious about with your books, I've always wanted to ask you this, you usually have more than 2 points of view even. So you've usually got 3, and do you ever have 4? I can't remember.
I had a road trip book called The Long Way Home that was 4 women. And I remember I had only planned for it to be 3, but then one woman invited her reclusive neighbor along. And I have no idea why. I'm not going to say they have a life of their own, because obviously I wrote it, but it seemed like a really good idea. And I remember saying to Greg, 4 characters, there's their backstory, and then you have to tell the current storyline, and then what going forward. And he said, well, why did you pick 4? And I'm like, I don't know. Seems like a really good idea. So I would love to simplify it, but apparently, and I think this is true for most writers and authors, we have a voice or a style. Apparently, this is mine. So far, it's worked for me. Like I
Well, yeah,
said,
and this episode hasn't aired yet, but we had Liz Talley on recently, and she said that I think it was her agent or editor said, her books read fast. And that I would say that's true for yours too, even though, yeah, there are these multiple points of view. And then as the reader, at some point they will converge. That's just something we kind of know. Like, oh, this is obviously this writer's not writing 2 short stories. You know what I mean?
Thank God.
But they never seem it never drags. It's always like rolling along quickly. And I enjoy that.
I try to almost have a little tiny bit of an overlap. So if she's seeing the little girl in the window, a scene later, a little later, might be the little girl thinking about when she was washing the dishes and she was pulled away. So you're like, oh, okay, so that is what she saw. So, I mean, you don't want to leave a reader hanging, and yet you don't want to reveal too much. There's kind of a balance that I like to keep.
Yeah, and one thing I appreciate about your books, and because this kind of frustrates me with sometimes other books, I heard this advice, I can't remember where, it was probably one of these writing books that I read years ago, but it said, you never tell the reader the same thing twice. You have to trust that they're smart enough that they got the clue the first time. Or if they're having an inner monologue or something about their crisis or their relationship or whatever, you don't repeat the same thought patterns because we already got those. And I think you do that really, really well.
Well, thank you. I actually feel like it doesn't hurt to remind the reader as long as you don't hit them over the head with it.
Right.
Well,
especially in a mystery or a suspense where you kind of need to make sure they do get it, but like you said, not knock them over the head. But I just find I think, what do they call it? Nasal peering or whatever.
Navel gazing.
Navel gazing, yeah. I'm like, what is the word? Yeah, gazing, which is a word I use way too much in my fiction. But yeah, I mean, just books that are too much inside the head and they go on with their thinking. And those books to me do not move quickly enough, but that's just me. All right, so what parts of writing fiction are the easiest for you and what are the hardest?
I actually really love all of it. I love getting the idea. I love starting it. I love writing it. The part that's actually the hardest, though, is I would say maybe 30,000 words in, 40,000 words in, I will have a kind of a little panic attack thinking either A, this isn't going to work, this is stupid. I'm very hard on myself, apparently. Or that I don't have enough story to have a complete book. Like, well, this is turning out to be a novella. What was I thinking? This isn't. And very often I'll say, I just spent X number of weeks or months on this book and I have to scrap the whole thing. I've yet to scrap a book. But, I go through this every time where I get an actual physical knot in my stomach that feels like I'm in pain, physical pain, like I can't pull this off. I don't remember how I ever did it. It's not working. And then very often I'll take a day or two off. And sometimes I'll wake up in the morning and I'll have a solution. Sometimes more recently, I've tried talking it through with other members of my family.
Mm-hmm.
One time I was talking to one of my kids, my son, Jack, and I'm like, he said something about one of my books. And I said, you know about that book? He's like, I came up with the ending. I hope I know about it.
We better hope that our children never get together in person because they would have so many stories to share because we're so alike in our process, everything. Because whenever I get to that point, Emerson and Cliff are like, oh, so are you at 40,000 words? I'm like, yeah. They're like, you get through it every time. But yes, I also have, Emerson and I take walks together sometimes, and I've been bouncing ideas off of her. And she always has some good ones. And she said the other day, she's like, oh, Mom, I have all the good ideas for your books.
If you heard Jack tell it, he writes my books. I'm like, just
I love it.
Throwing out a suggestion is not writing it.
Oh, that's good. All right. So what is you've already given a little bit, but what writing advice would you offer to aspiring authors?
This is writing advice that everyone gives, but it's so true. Just keep going. Don't give up. just keep writing. You might have written what you think is the best book you're capable of writing, but believe me, you're capable of writing more and better. Just keep going, persevere. If you're starting out and you self-published and no one is buying your book, that is heartbreaking. And I understand. I've had, out of the 20 some books, I've had books that did incredibly well where I just can't even believe how well they've done, to some that just never really took off. So I can tell you, I thought the duds were just as great as the ones that did well. I can't explain it. Just for some reason, things resonate with readers and others don't. I always say that writers were kind of a weird combination of having a low self-esteem while also at the exact same time thinking that we wrote the best thing in the entire world and everyone should read it. So
And why isn't everybody reading it?
I know it's heartbreaking, isn't it? And I remember when I wrote the first book and I was sending it out, someone saying, "Well, this isn't quite for us, but send us another one." And I'm like, "But I don't have another one. I just have this one."
Yeah. And if you think it's decent, then why don't you just take it?
That's right. What's wrong with this? So, so that's my advice, is just keep going. Try to take in everything you can on the craft of writing, because there's information out there. You know that you've gotten better when you look at something you've done previously and it's not as good as you thought it was at the time. And you're like, "Oh, I would completely rewrite this."
Mhm. Yeah.
You should not feel embarrassed about the earlier efforts. You should be happy that you've improved.
Yeah, definitely. Do you have a craft writing book that you would recommend?
I feel like over the years I have read everything. I have a book that I like. It's not craft per se. That I use sometimes for plotting, and I don't use it verbatim. It's not like a roadmap that I follow, but I use it to jumpstart ideas when I get stuck. And it's called The Writer's Journey by Christopher Vogler. He was a script consultant, and he noticed that all great stories share some commonalities. And he developed this theory, and it was somewhat based on work done by Joseph Campbell. It's an interesting read, just if you just want to read through it, talking about story structure. Sometimes I'm 3/4 of the way through writing a book, and I'll go back and look, did I do at least the majority of them? I don't think you have to have all of the components of the story, and I don't think they have to be in that order, but it's definitely a great jumping off point for me. Oh, and
You
I've also
talk
written a craft book. Did I ever tell you that?
I don't
I
think
wrote
so.
Yeah, I did a talk at my local library. And when I came, I had a lot of people asking for the notes from the talk. So I compiled them into a writing guide. It's called Write That Novel. And I just published it, and it doesn't really sell like hotcakes, but the people that do buy it and read it very often message me and say they found it immensely helpful. So
Well, that's
I feel
great.
good about it being out there.
I had no idea. I'm learning so many new things about
Oh,
you.
sure.
All right, you already talked about how you have the 30 to 40,000 word doubt. But what about after you finish, or even after it's out there in the public? Do you feel nervous at all, or you're like, "Nope, it's going to be great"?
Oh, absolutely. And if I get a bad review in the early days of a book being out, I think, "Oh, maybe they're right. Maybe I should just pull this. Maybe I'm embarrassing myself, or maybe I don't know, because I don't feel like I'm a good judge of my own work. So I very often have doubts, even books that are doing really well. And I have a book that's got over 7,000 reviews, which I've never had that many. And it's rated like 4.4 out of 5 or something. So just for me, phenomenally well. And someone will write something and point out something like, "Well, I don't understand why they didn't just do this or that." And I'll feel this wave of shame, like, how could I
Hmm.
have, and it might be a minor point that nobody else noticed. So yeah, I definitely don't feel like I'm all that, and that people will love everything I write. I hope that they do. So yeah, it's still there. The imposter syndrome.
Oh, yeah. How do you know when a book is done?
Sometimes I can't even look at the manuscript anymore. I've written it and added things and taken things out and tweaked things, and then I usually send it to a few beta readers and get their feedback. At that point, what I'm really looking for is continuity issues, inconsistencies, pacing problems, an ending that maybe is too abrupt, things that aren't clear. All those things I like to have worked out. before I send it to an editor, either an editor at a publishing house or my own editor.
All right. Do you have an ideal reader in mind when you write? Like, do you write for someone, or do you just have like a general idea of what your readers are like?
At this point, I do have a general idea of what my readers are like, just from hearing from different readers. I would say that I write to entertain myself, or I write a book that I'd love to read, but I also keep readers in mind. Very early in my publishing journey, I got a really nice email from a woman who said, "I really like your books because I can share them with my 12-year-old daughter and my senior citizen mom." She said, you might reference some violence, but it's not graphic. We're not in the midst of it. It's interesting enough. It doesn't have profanity." And so that stuck in my brain. And later on, I had a book where two ladies were being held up by a guy, and they managed to get the gun away from him and shoot him in the leg. And he swore. He actually used, as they say in A Christmas Story, the mother of all swear words. And I turned it into my editor at Amazon Publishing Lake Union, and it bothered me. I thought, I've never done that before. I thought it was appropriate to the scene and to the person who, it happened to. But I contacted my editor. I emailed him and said, "I've had a change of mind. I want you to take that out." And he was like, "Oh, Karen, you don't need to pander." That's what he said. And he was always trying to talk me off the ledge, and off the edge of the ledge.
The ledge, yeah.
And so he did change it, and I was really glad that I had taken it out. It wasn't necessary. People still enjoyed the book. No one said, "Oh, I think you would have used stronger language than that." They just accepted it. It was the way it was written. So that's something that I try to keep in mind.
Does your family read your books?
Some family members read some books. My son Charlie read the entire Edgewood series because the main characters, one was a 16-year-old guy, and he would tell me, nobody calls it that, Mom. Nobody, he would never say that. So he read it with an eye towards helping me out. And he said he really enjoyed them, which I thought was really great. My daughter just read a horror novel that I wrote under a pseudonym, which does have profanity and some sexual references. And so I told her, don't be shocked. And she thought it was pretty tame. You know what I mean? I thought, oh, here I'm being very edgy, and she enjoyed it. But I have to say, and my son Jack has read various books and apparently writes them as well. But my husband has never read any of my books. He went to a book signing that I was appearing at, and I read an excerpt from one of my books, and he laughed out loud. Oh, and I thought, oh, interesting.
That is funny.
I'm seeing him 3 rows back, chuckling. I'm like, okay, maybe you would like them, but maybe not. I don't know.
Well, now that he's retiring, maybe he'll have more time. You should just buy a copy of every paperback and just stick it on his chair.
Just sit it there. Yeah. That would be very subtle, Tess. I just wanted to store them here.
Yeah. All right. Well, what's the best part of being an author?
I'm a homebody. So the best part for me is working from home. And the second best part, well, no, it's equal, is that I get to dictate the terms of the job. I love coming up with the stories I want to come up with. It keeps it really fun for me.
Who has been your biggest supporter as you built your career and your craft?
Absolutely, it has been Greg. He would tell people, my wife's a writer, and this was before I had anything to show for it. And I say he was a patron of the arts because the whole 10 years that I wasn't getting published, he was like, don't worry about it. He really believed at some point I would get published. Even on those days, I wasn't sure I would. And he just kept doling out money for, writing software and toner and, all the things you need. If I wanted to go to a writer's conference in, out of state or something, that was money our family could not afford. And I would really weigh, is this going to be helpful? Will I make connections? Will I, and he was always like, do it. If you think it'll help, do it. So absolutely, that would be Greg McQuestion.
All right. So what about your why? Do you have an idea of what it is you're trying to Like your overall kind of theme?
I don't know if I have a certain thing I want to put out in the world. Like, I'd love to say I have a greater thematic issue that I feel like I'm going to contribute great things to the world. And I really don't have lofty ideals like that. I think that I really just want people to be entertained and feel that feeling that you get when you read a good book and you get to the last page and you get that satisfied feeling that, like, oh, I enjoyed that. That was a great way to pass a few hours.
Hmm.
So if I can do that for a few people, hopefully more than a few even, my work is done.
Well, I think you can say you've accomplished that. All right, before we go to our fun extra questions, what are you working on now?
Right now, I'm working on another domestic suspense called The House Sitter. And I had that moment of panic a couple days ago, like where I was like, I don't think this works. It's a really preposterous sort of premise. And actually, Jack and my daughter Maria and Greg, we talked through it. I didn't use their ideas exactly, but some of the things they said were like, oh, I could use that and then do that. So I don't get stuck a lot, but when I do, it really helps. So it's the house sitter. The jumping off point of the story is a woman's in the house. She says she's the house sitter, but she doesn't belong there. And then as the story unfolds, the reader finds out why.
Ooh, I can't wait to read that one. All right. What is one food that will never get past your lips?
Crickets or any insects, really.
This is the year of it's some kind of unusual cricket that's only around every 17 years.
Is it cicadas?
Yes. And supposedly that's a delicacy, and people wait 17 years to have the next one.
Well, I will gladly offer up my share for someone else.
Who would you want to play you in a movie?
My son Jack once told me that when I get really mad, my face looks like Kathy Bates in Misery. So I have to say Kathy Bates.
Oh my God, you live with a rough crowd, I'm telling you. Wow. I mean, not that that's an insult, because I love her, but
she is a fine actor, and
she really is. Yes. Oh, that's funny. All right, what superpower would you pick?
Time travel.
Oh, that's a good one, especially for an historical writer.
I think so too.
Yeah. At the end of your life, what do you hope you'll have accomplished?
I hope that the little corner of the world that I've inhabited is better for me having been here, and that my kids turn out to be productive, happy people.
What is the worst job you've ever had?
I worked as a waitress in a restaurant where they told me I had to change my name because there was a hostess named Karen. And and so they wanted to call me by my middle name, which I do not like and do not answer to. And then they wanted me to pick a different name. And I'm like, I can't guarantee I'll answer to it. I was being a little, like I am. And also the owner yelled at me the second night. And I went home and I was like, I can't work there anymore. I was like, like now I'd be like, are you kidding me? But at the time I was like agonized over it. And so finally I called and talked to his wife. And I said, I'm not coming back. I think I had the uniform. Like, we put the uniform, someone will drop it off. And she said, well, what are we going to do Friday night? And I said, well, what did you do last Friday? I was like, I've only worked there 2 days and I was training both of them. Like their whole business was going to fall apart because I wasn't there.
Oh, that was the beginning of the Karen name problem.
I think
that
so.
was a premonition.
I should have known back then. Karen is not a name you want to go by.
Which I'm offended by that for you. I've said that before.
Thank you.
All right. If you could instantly become an expert in something, what would it be?
I would like to be able to speak a lot of foreign languages.
That's a good one. What's your favorite scent?
I have a very poor sense of smell. My family, I'm known for it. I do like citrus.
What is the most terrifying thing you've ever done?
I went skydiving when I was in my early 20s. And believe me, when they open that door and they tell you to swing your legs out and sit on the edge, there is nothing. Well, I'm sure there are things more terrifying. I have not experienced anything more terrifying.
When people pronounce words incorrectly, do you let them know?
Sometimes I'll say, oh, I've always heard it pronounced such and such. You know what I mean? But I wouldn't do it to a complete stranger, someone in my family or, an acquaintance or friend, because I am 100% certain that I am an offender in this area because I have a reading vocabulary. So I try to be kind.
If you could live your life over again, would you want to?
Every single person we've interviewed is like, absolutely, or with some changes. I have to say no. I just,
Wow.
sometimes I wonder if I'm going to get through the week. I just, that sounded more dour than I wanted it to, but I had a really not joyful childhood. It was really tough and I wouldn't do it again. Would I get married to the same man and have the same kids and still be a writer? Absolutely. Those parts were all great, but you can't pick and choose. And sometimes I think that my childhood is what enriches my writing. So I guess I don't want to undo it. I just don't want to go through it again.
Yeah, that's a good answer. All right. Well, this has been really fun, and I've learned a lot of new things about you, which is cool.
Well, thank you, Tess. It was fun talking.
It was, yeah. This was really fun. I can't wait to talk about the worst job I ever had, but I have to save it for my day.
Oh,
it's not
we'll
Tess
get there.
Day. It's Karen Day. Yeah.
Could I have my own day, Tess? Is it all right with
Yeah,
you?
just one day without me butting in. Yeah.
It's not always about you, Tess.
Oh, I don't know. I can't believe that's true. I'm sure it's about me. Anyway, all right. Well, we will sign off now. I'll check on you with our next guest, but also on Tess Day.
Okay.
Thank you for listening to Behind the Book, brought to you by authors Tess Thompson and Karen McQuestion. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and post a question in the comments section. This has been Behind the Book.